Thank you for remaining with us. I'm glad to see each and every one of you, and hope that you enjoy yourself today. On the flyer, which I read right before I came in here to see what this was all about, no, not really, don't get nervous, it did say that in the afternoon we were going to have a nature of mind teaching. But according to the way the flyer is reading, it seems as though we're going to have an approximately 2-hour-long nature of mind teaching, which I've never heard done, actually, because the nature of one's mind is so simple that the more words you use to describe it, the farther away from the true explanation it becomes, since the true explanation cannot be accomplished in words at all. So what are we going to do? Mostly what we do when we describe the nature of your mind is to describe what it is not. In fact, that's almost exclusively how one comes to understand the nature of one's mind. In fact, when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of one's practice, the way that one experiences the nature of their mind, their true primordial wisdom nature, is by pacifying all of the discursive thoughts and all of the obstacles that arise to that pure perception. So one doesn't actually do anything in order to experience that nature. One cannot aim for the nature, because in aiming for an object, in having that subjective, objective experience, one would miss the point entirely. So what ends up happening is that one spends the entirety of one's practice career purifying all of the defilements, actually, and obscurations that are associated with subjective objective perception. It's almost like we come into it with a romantic notion, thinking that this nature of mind thing has got to be like really hot stuff. And so you think you're going for an executive position. I'm going to experience the nature of my mind. Wow, I'm going to get the big picture. And you end up spending the rest of your career washing windows. And of course one has to understand this by understanding, as I described this morning, the faults of cyclic existence, the faults of that kind of dualistic perception, in order to understand just how glorious washing windows can be. So you too could have a spiritual career of washing windows if you stay with me this afternoon. Isn't that great? And here you are. That's what we're going to do together. In order to begin washing windows, we put on our rubber gloves and we get our stinky ammonia mixed up with water and get our brushes out and start scrubbing away. In order to scrub away, one has to really open one's eyes. You can't be scrubbing away when you don't get that dirt is happening. I think it would be possible for a non-seeing person, for a blind person, to be able to scrub a window, but I think it would be more likely that they would do a better job, or a better job would be done, if someone that could see where the smudges were, obviously, were to do the cleaning. So we have to think in that regard. And in order to do that, in order to begin with that, let's see if we can uncover our own personal motivation. Oh, motivation about what? Well, let's try general motivation. Let's try anything. The reason why I don't want to cover specific motivation about specific things is that you can argue with that, and I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to argue back, because if you argue back, we're going to waste our time together. We'll get further and further away from the real point. So let's talk about specific, non-specific motivation. Let's talk about it in general, in theory. Would you like to discover what your real motivations are? Do you think that you don't know? Well, I've had a lot of people tell me that they really don't know. They'll say to me, oh, I didn't know I was doing that. Or, gee, did I really think that way? That kind of thing. People indicate all the time that they don't really know what's going on inside of them, that they feel estranged from their own internal processes. So let me make it very clear as to how you can find out exactly what your internal processes are. You can look at your life. Well, that's real good news. You can look at your life, and particularly you can look at your mental and emotional condition. Literally, there is no way that you could have gotten into your present condition, whatever it might be, your mental and emotional condition, and particularly, and also rather, you could not have gotten into your life situation, whatever that might be, without having the motivation to do so. Well, this is a real hard pill to swallow, because some of us are a little confused about certain things, and some of us are kind of unhappy, and some of us don't like the life situation that we find ourselves in. Or we might like some aspects of it, but not others. And in doing that, we might say, well, I really aimed for the things that I like. You see, that's what I really went for. But the things that came with it, the mixed bag of tricks that I seem to have gotten, that just sort of came from nowhere, that landed in my lap, this I'm not responsible for. This I wasn't motivated to have, and that was not my intention. And likewise, if we are in a confused mental state or a confused emotional state, if we really don't know how we got to feeling the way we did, if we really don't know how our mental condition got to be as maybe unstable as it has, or maybe as confused as it has, then we like to say that it's just always been that way, or, well, I just don't know how to change, or, well, I didn't mean for it to be like this. I didn't try to get this way. That was not my intention. Well, the problem with that idea is that if you go on convincing yourself of this, you will never have at your disposal the antidote. You'll never have the cure. You'll never really understand cause and effect relationships sufficiently as to be able to apply the cure. So, one thing that I can tell you from my own experience, and that I can tell you from watching sentient beings do what they do, and that I can tell you because this is the Buddha's teaching. Everything that you experience, everything that is part of your mental condition and your emotional condition, that is part of your life situation, with no exception, without any exception at all, every single piece of the fabric of your experience is due to the ripening of previous causes. These previous causes did not ripen outside of you. They did not ripen within the person next to you. They did not ripen because of the person that preceded you. A good example of that is the kind of attitude that people have when they get a job and they feel that they have inherited the mess of the person who left the job before them. Haven't you ever been in a situation like that where you look around and say, well, clearly I didn't make this mess? Well, if you were your own best friend, your own advocate, your own champion, you would look at yourself and say, but clearly it is your mess. And so clearly there has to be a connection here somehow. But unfortunately, we don't do that. We don't do that on our jobs. We don't do that on our minds. We don't do that in our hearts. We don't do that anywhere in our lives. We simply feel that this is the mess that we've gotten due to someone else, and maybe it's a package deal, or due to something else. We don't really understand that everything we have as an experience, everything we see, everything we feel within our hearts and our minds, even our own perception, even the fact that we perceive people in our lives in certain ways, or circumstances in our lives in certain ways, even the fact that we perceive situations differently from day to day. Hasn't that happened to you? Haven't you had a certain situation, like a work situation or a family situation or any kind of situation, that one day will seem acceptable? You can live with it. It rolls off your back sort of like water off a duck's back. You can deal with it. But on other days you find that you take it personally, that it's a real hardship to you, that you feel like you're crippled with it. These kinds of things happen. This kind of experience, whatever it is due to the ripening of causes that were previously enacted. And these causes are ripening within your very mind stream, within the continuum of your experience as a sentient being. These seeds ripen, just like seeds in a garden, and with the same inevitability. That is to say, that if you throw weed seeds in your garden, guaranteed that you're going to get some weeds in the future. On the other hand, if you put some flower seeds in your garden, guaranteed you'll get some flowers in the future. Actually, the teachings are that not all seeds, flowers, and weeds may necessarily ripen. That it may be possible to catch the wind with a lasso, that it may be possible for fire to burn cold, but it is never possible for karma to ripen in any other than a very exacting way. These are the teachings. What they're saying is that it's more possible for these other things to happen than it is for karma not to ripen. So then, in looking at our experience on a very personal, intimate, feeling and perceptual level, as well as the more obvious, grosser experiences that we have within our life situations. These things all are a reflection of our activities, of our previous causes, and of our intentions. One of the worst mistakes that I think any student can make is to not take responsibility for that. Or to not take responsibility for that in a real way. Sometimes playing that game can be very subtle and you don't always realize that you're doing it. You can say to yourself, yes, okay, that's what the Buddha taught. So I'm going to say that right now. I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to say that I accept that. I'm going to say that whatever's happening to me now, I must have created the causes for in the past. So I'm going to be very brave and very courageous, and I'm going to say that. But when it comes down to specific instances, and someone says to you, you know you're not being very nice right now, or you're being a little selfish, you'd say, I never meant to be selfish. I never meant for that to happen. So you see, on one level, you're doing it in theory, where it doesn't cost you too much, where it makes you look good to do it. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty and you really have to take responsibility and maybe take a little medicine with it too, then maybe our tune changes a little bit. And I think that this is true of all of us. I'm not particularly pointing my finger at you and saying, you're doing it. This is true of all of us. We may not want to take responsibility at that time because it's just too real. But it's when it's the realest that we really have to do it. Because that's when the medicine is really there. When you adopt these ideas in theory and never apply them, it's a lot like having the medicine on your shelf. Knowing what the sickness is, knowing what the cure is, having the medicine on your shelf and saying, it's a great medicine, and I bet it really works, and never taking it. You can get real sick doing that, and you can continue just as you are, unchanging. But on the other hand, if when it comes down to your own personal life and your own personal sickness and your own personal condition, and you actually take the medicine down and understand that it works and swallow it, the event is completely different. What happens to you is completely different. So while the theoretical acceptance of one's life as being a true reflection of the content of one's mind stream and of one's intention, and the acceptance of one's life as a vehicle by which one can perfect one's intention and perfect one's activity. This is very different from a theoretical acceptance. You should start with a theoretical acceptance. You have to start there. You have to be able to say to yourself, I understand the faults of cyclic existence, as we discussed this morning. I understand that there is a goal, and that the goal is enlightenment itself. I understand the value of that, and I understand the necessity to apply the teaching or the doctrine accordingly. But again, make no mistake, it is not enough, it will never be enough to stop there, to simply adapt a view and to never use it, or to simply decide that in theory something seems to be right and to never apply it to your particular life, tasting and sampling what you are producing and changing what is necessary for you to change. There needs to be a philosophical understanding and a direct and responsible acceptance. They are really two different things. It really doesn't seem that way, but they really are. Granted, that's a difficult thing to understand, but it must be understood. When we examine the content of our lives, we should start by examining the condition of our minds. Actually, I find that people are fairly truthful about the condition of their minds, especially if they've come to the point where they really wish to adopt a path or some technology for spiritual development. When they come to the point that they want to receive some teachings, generally they seem to be quite realistic about the fact that their minds are a little bit like a squirrel cage, and that they recognize that their minds are not at peace. Wouldn't you say that was safe to say about most people, and even about ourselves? That our minds are not really at peace, that we have some degree of confusion, that we are somewhat at a loss as to how to produce the results that we really want in our lives, that not everything we try really works, and that we are experiencing, at least to some degree, a dissatisfaction, that what we have lived up until this moment may not be enough. When we actually begin to practice and to meditate, we often go through a period where we find that we're in worse shape than we thought. This is always a terrible, horrible burden to bear for the people that begin to get into the spiritual life, because they get into the spiritual life thinking, oh, I'm going to be good looking now. They think, I'm really going to shine. I'm really going to be spectacular. If I thought I was good before, think how great I'm going to be now. Not only am I going to be handsome, but I'm going to be holy too. You know, and it's just, you kind of have this idea that you're going to be the best that you can be. But that was actually, that had more to do with joining the army, didn't it? Be the best that you could be, join the army. I don't think they ever said that in Buddhism. Be the best that you could be. That would imply, well, we won't get into that. But anyway, that would imply that you were polishing up your ego, which, interestingly enough, is often what we first try to do when we get into spiritual life, until we learn that that isn't going to work. Right before we understand the faults of cyclic existence, we spend the first part of our career polishing up our ego and being a really holy person. And while we're busy polishing up our egos and being a really holy person, what we're really doing is digging ourselves in deeper and deeper and deeper. It's kind of like you buy a shovel and just start digging in. And you know what you're digging into, don't you? You know what you're shoveling. So people often come to their teachers, and I know this has happened to me, people come to me after being involved in their spirituality for some period of time, and they just can't figure out why everything's going wrong for them. Well, that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is it's going right for them. They are discovering that they have traveled for a long time down a dead-end street, and they're kind of kissing it goodbye. And sometimes when you're kissing goodbye, you have to make it a little romantic, and you get sort of involved in it. So when you're kissing your ego bye, you sometimes court it just a little bit more. Have any of you noticed that that's happened to you? I love it. And we're always so attractive when we do it, too. So after a period of time, we get past that. But the confusion that we feel has to do with our inability to really understand direct cause and effect relationships. With our inability to really get that everything we see is a direct reflection of the content of our mind stream. How can we even begin to kind of pick apart the sea of our intention? I mean, there's just like an ocean of mixed up intentions that we've had, and we've had a lot of time to develop them too, because according to the Buddha's teaching, this is not our first life. In fact, we have been involved in cyclic existence since time out of mind is the phrase that's used. That's considered to be a very long time, if you can measure time like that. So we've had a real long time to mess ourselves up pretty well. If we examine our intentions through examining our lives, what we see is that we have managed to be extremely fixated on self-nature as being inherently real. And if you don't think that you are extremely fixated on self-nature as being inherently real, in fact, if you think that you are floating around in an egoless state, that you have come to that point, I bet it would take me about 30 seconds to convince you that you're wrong about that. All I have to do is take a little safety pin that I carry on my person regularly for just the right students and walk up to you and start poking around. And just any minute, you'll remember that you are a person. And you will run as fast as you can or fight back. All of us have the experience of self-nature, and it's very real to us. So that our intention had to be to constantly define and redefine and establish the boundaries and the borders of that self-nature, that we have spent a great deal of time in that process of distinction, in that dualistic kind of perception. And we have spent a great deal of time in all of the proliferations that come from that, the exaggerations that occur due to that perception. If we examine our minds, the content of our minds, we will discover that our minds are constantly changing. That we don't feel the same way about something even 10 minutes from the time that we thought about it. Have you noticed that about yourself? How hard that's harder to live with than the fact that you do have something to live with. Whatever it is that you feel that you're dealing with, you will feel differently about from day to day, and even from moment to moment. And even some event like an encounter with another person who has an opinion about something that you're thinking about will cause you to change your opinion radically. All of our feelings are constantly changing. And if we are able, through a tremendous blessing, to be able to step back and really watch our minds do that, you have to be able to see for yourself that the mind is constantly involved in a process of confusion. It really remains quite confused. We try to fixate and get our bearings on these perceptual experiences that we are having and the conclusions that we draw from them, trying to remain safe and fixed on these things or through these things, when we find ourselves constantly changing an opinion from moment to moment. We have good days and we have bad days. We have days in which we're very rigid and days in which we flow much more easily. We have days in which we're moody and days in which we're very expansive. We have days in which we experience a great deal of contraction and days in which we are very, very relaxed. And even within these days, there are fluctuations. So from that, we must understand that we have put a great deal of energy into desire. That is to say, the desire associated with perceiving self-nature as inherently real. Upon perceiving self-nature as being inherently real, we are constantly revolving in the experience of perception and therefore acceptance and rejection. And one cannot experience acceptance and rejection and even neutrality, which can also be experienced, without nurturing the great tree of desire that seems to be growing within the garden of our minds. In order to understand the depth of this condition and the depth of this experience, we have to begin by understanding that every single kind of perception that we have of any type, whether it be the subtle internal perceptions of feeling and thought and even consciousness, or whether it be the gross and heavy perceptions associated with what we call external sight and hearing and touch, these things that are solid, like that. They all begin with attraction, repulsion, or neutrality. And they all continue to revolve within that realm. They never quite change in their character. They're always thus. A very simple way to test yourself to see if this is in fact true is to watch what you do when you first open your eyes. When you first open your eyes in the morning, for instance, you decide how you feel. And you either like how you feel or you don't. You form an opinion about it. And you can test yourself by having someone blindfold you and walk you into a room that you've never been in before, and then take the blindfold off and watch your mind. Watch your mind carefully and watch what it does. What it does is to perceive, and it can only perceive through the experience of attraction or repulsion and sometimes neutrality. But even that neutrality has to do with attraction and repulsion. In that feeling neutral is still within that realm. In that reacting in a neutral way is still within that realm. The only way that one can really understand how that would still be involved in attraction and repulsion is to understand that in the mind of enlightenment, one does not perceive in the same way that a sentient being perceives. In the mind of enlightenment, all perceptions, all conditions arise naturally and are instantaneously, spontaneously liberated. There is no clinging to effect at all. Can you understand that? no clinging to effect, no condition, because all spontaneously arises and is spontaneously complete without conditioning, free of all such defilements. But not us. No. We get in that room and we're into attraction or repulsion or neutrality, and we're having an experience that is absolutely based on the presupposition of self-nature and on the fixation of self-nature, and therefore the necessity of dualistic experience. Every single experience that we have, watch your seconds go by. Watch the content of each second. Sit down in a quiet place and watch the nature of your mind. Watch the mind as it plays its games. Watch the dance that it does. All of the experiences that it has, that you have to do with that. So from that, we can understand that since beginningless time, it has been our intention to define self-nature. To define it through experiencing relative to self-nature, but the bottom line is to define self-nature. It doesn't stop there. It actually gets much easier to understand after that point. Because after that point, we're pretty readable. If we experience, let's say, loneliness in our lives, well, it wasn't your intention to experience loneliness, was it? I mean, like, you didn't get up one day and say, hey, I'd love to be lonely today. I'm like into the blues or something, and I'd really like to experience some first-class loneliness. Please. Of course we don't do that. You'd have to be a fool to do something like that. Or we don't get up one day and say, hey, I'd really like to get into some hatred. Come on, it's going to be fun. Of course we don't do that. We don't mean to be hateful. We don't mean to be lonely. We don't mean to be sad. We don't mean to be depressed. We don't mean to be hysterical. We don't mean to be confused. We don't mean to be poor. We don't mean to be late. We don't mean to be selfish. We don't mean to not get our reports in on time. We don't mean to not get our work done. We didn't mean to get to bed so late. We didn't mean not to set the clock. The list is endless. But in fact, everything that we see is an expression of the content of our mind stream. Well, hey, no sentient being means to have hatred, greed, and ignorance within their mind stream, but they did mean to fixate on ego. And hey, nobody meant to be lonely, but they did actually mean to incur the causes of loneliness when they did them. Well, what are the causes of loneliness? Well, according to the Buddhist teaching, for you to be lonely now, you would have to have been lacking in generosity in the past, or unkind to loved ones, or generally uncaring for others in the past. Well, did you mean to do that? Well, maybe you didn't mean to do that then either. Well, let's see now. If you are just habitually uncaring for others, then must have been some time in the past you developed that habit. Well, gosh, maybe you didn't mean to do it any of those times. Well, what was your intention? You have a choice here. If you want to say, well, hey, I just never meant to get in this mess. I never meant to be lonely. I never meant to be unkind. I never meant to experience any of this discomfort that I'm feeling now. I just never meant this to happen. The option that you have under that condition is to walk around in la-la land for the rest of your life feeling totally and completely impotent. If, on the other hand, you look at the condition of your life and accept that you have created the causes for that condition and that you must now apply the antidote, with that kind of firmness, you have a way out. The experience that you will have after a decision such as that, without trying to wiggle out of it by saying it just wasn't your fault or it just wasn't your intention, is a potent experience. You have the option of potency. Why you would want to give that over by saying, well, gee, just forgive me because I never meant for any of this to happen. To who? Who are you asking, first of all? I hope you don't ask me because I can't do it. Who are you asking to forgive you? If you find someone that can do that, let me know. I'd like to have his phone number or hers. If you give that power over, it is no longer your power. And you are able to do that because it's your power to give or to use. If, on the other hand, you take control by saying, this content of my mind, this content of my life that I'm looking at must be a direct response to the condition of my mind stream, and work with that effectively, then the experience of potency, and in fact, potency itself, is yours. Why is it that most people don't do that? Well, because we are wandering in confusion. And because, most of all, more than that, we have not done what I talked about this morning, which is to discover and evaluate for ourselves the faults of cyclic existence. We are still revolving in false hope. Don't you find yourself still doing that? Don't you find yourself hoping that somehow it will work out all right? That somehow you'll wake up and all your troubles will be gone? Or that when you get older they'll be gone? Or that when things change they'll be gone? Or that when someone loves you, they'll be gone. Or that when someone loves you right, they'll be gone. Whenever that happens. Or that when you get what you need, or the right job, or when you gain weight or lose weight, or whatever it is that you think that you have to do, then maybe it'll work out. We hold out false hope. We have not determined for ourselves the faults of cyclic existence. And we are satisfied, or trying to be satisfied, feeding ourselves this sugar, which will eventually leave us flat. We're not remembering that the teaching is that these things are impermanent, that within cyclic existence there are not the causes naturally occurring for enlightenment. And we are not remembering that happiness really comes when all defilements and all obstacles that keep us from knowing our true nature are really pacified. That is to say, we are happy when we attain realization. And it's not happy, of course, in the ordinary human sense. One must understand that we're talking about two different things entirely. This taking of responsibility has a lot to do with understanding the nature of one's mind. This recognizing one's intention and accepting the faults of cyclic existence has a great deal to do with one's capacity to understand the real goal. Because if not, what we'll do is have a kind of patch-up spirituality, which is we just do something spiritual and hope that it works out. Or we just do something spiritual and feel good about that. Or, which means that we just do something spiritual and then spend the rest of our lives trying to get these temporary happinesses that will always disappoint us. So these are the chasms that we can, chasms? Which is it? Chasms, thank you. That we fall into constantly and consistently. We're always doing it. We're even doing it at this moment when we listen to these teachings and say, that's pretty severe. I'd like to see if there isn't an easier way. Let's see if we can take a shortcut. Let's see if we can. If we take a shortcut, how would you like to take a shortcut? What can we possibly do? Maybe we can just try to be happy. Maybe we can just live a good life. Maybe we can just think pure thoughts. Didn't Donovan used to say that about 25 years ago? Where is he anyway? Nobody knows. Maybe we could just think pure thoughts and eventually it will come to us. Well, the problem with taking that shortcut is that you don't know if it works until you die. And that's when you don't want to find out. You really want to have your bases covered before then. You don't want to be in the position where you're just ready to kick the old buckaroony and you're ready to die and the breath is leaving your body and you go, oh no, I think I made a mistake. Well, because you don't have a replay there. There is no replay button at the end. So what you want to do is make sure that you cover your bases pretty thoroughly. I've never known, I cannot imagine anyone at the end of their life saying, gee, I just put too much work into that spiritual stuff. Or, gosh, I just meditated too darn much. Or, gee, my mind's just too darn spacious and stable. Or, gosh, I wish I hadn't put so much time into being pure. But I can well imagine someone saying, I think I blew it, because I didn't take advantage of this opportunity.
Sure.